Hello again, everybody. This is Steve, coming to you with a new video on writing. This one is about genealogies and heritages. Nowadays, this isn't such a big thing as it was in the old days, but back in antiquity, your genealogy and your bloodline was a huge aspect to society. You know, like if you were related to a particular great person in history, then you were, kind of the top dog versus somebody else who might have been related to somebody who was, like a slave or something. And, that's not to say that your genealogy or your character's genealogy is going to affect the present. There's people that have come from backgrounds as slaves, as pirates, as stuff like that, and they've become great and incredible people. There's, there was people in antiquity and the recent history that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents were all common thieves. And they were, they decided, I'm going to turn over a new leaf and I'm going to do something that makes me an honorable person. I'm trying to think of what his name is. It was one guy that was I think he was a Surgeon General for a while, but he grew up as a son of a single mom in the ghetto. And with his mom's help, he became a surgeon and became a really great and respected guy. Which, if you look at where his family came from, if I'm understanding this correctly, if I've got it wrong, I apologize. But from my understanding, his family lived in poverty through his parents. Well, his mom obviously did, but then like his grandparents, his great grandparents, and so on and so forth. So he came up from a heritage that was, it was ghetto, it was slum, it was lower into society, and yet he became this very rich, very famous surgeon. I can't think of his name. If I think of it, I'll mention it, but. If you go back to like antiquity, you have the aristocracy, the nobility. That was all about bloodlines. Like, I'm a noble, you're a commoner. And it was a kind of a caste system where your rank and your heritage and your bloodline determined what your place was in society. And that's not to say that that would necessarily hold you there. If you look at the Bible, if you look in Genesis, you have Jacob, aka Israel. You have one of his sons, Joseph. Joseph is sold by his brothers and made into a slave. He comes from I would say for that time period, what would be considered an average family, kind of a middle class family. I mean, Jacob was rich, but, as far as, like, some of the families in that time period, he would be kind of more like rich, or more like middle class or upper middle class. Because there was some people in that time period that made Israel look like a pauper. I mean, they were just stupid rich. So, like I say, he kind of falls, despite the money, the riches he had, it fell under, he kind of fell under middle class or upper middle class. Well, Joseph, as for those of you who've read the story, Joseph gets made into a slave. Well, then you go and he's made a slave under Potiphar. Well, then he so exemplifies himself, that he becomes the top slave in Potiphar's home. Well, and of course, Potiphar's wife sells him out because she wants to sleep with him. Joseph says no and gets thrown in jail. Well, then he exemplifies himself in jail, and then he turns around and you have the cupbearer and the baker who both get thrown into jail because somebody went and stole Pharaoh's cup, which, that's a bad idea. Don't mess with Pharaoh. But anyways, they both steal Pharaoh's cup, or not they both do. I should say one of them does. But they both end up in jail until they can figure out who did what and so forth. And eventually, the two of them have dreams. The baker gets one, and the the cupbearer gets one. The baker finds out he's gonna die in 3 days, and the other guy is gonna have his, be restored to his position. Which, for anybody who knows anything about antiquity, at least at least in Egypt, but definitely a lot of other places, the cupbearer was also kind of it was the title, but it was also kind of an official position that and it was also a dangerous position. So it was a rather lofty position, because basically what happened was the chef made the food, and they brought the food out. If you were the cupbearer, it was your job to test that food. You ate that food first, and if you dropped dead, then okay, the chef was probably going to lose his head too. And if he didn't, if you didn't die, then the king got his food and all was good. And usually they wouldn't eat off of Pharaoh's plate or the king's plate or whatever. They would eat. They would open the pot and test the food. And they just a little spoonful and test that food. Okay, that's good. You can serve that to the king or the pharaoh or whatever. So, like I say, the cupbearer was not a low position. It sounds like a low position because all you're doing is you're tasting food, and you're running, you're tasting the wine and running the cup back and forth to Pharaoh or the king or the emperor or whoever. But yeah, you were the guy that kept the king alive by making sure the food and the wine weren't poisoned. And then if the king wanted something, you were the top servant who ran that to him. So, Baker wasn't quite on that same level. He was still a royal baker, but he didn't have quite the same rank as the cupbearer. But anyhow, now that I've gotten off on that rabbit trail, Joseph ended up, interpreting their dreams. Sat in jail for a little bit while longer. Pharaoh has a dream. The cupbearer's like, "Oh yeah, I totally forgot about that guy," and tells Pharaoh about it. Joseph comes up, and Joseph interprets the dream and gives Pharaoh a suggestion. Pharaoh's like, this guy's pretty sharp, which, when considering where he came from, yeah, he's pretty sharp. Let's make him second highest in the kingdom. Now, with Joseph, he had the advantage that he came from a family that taught him, we call it Hebrew, but it was well, anyways, it was a common language at the time. It wasn't Aramaic. That came later on, but it was, Joseph and the others spoke the Hebrew language, which was, like I say, a common language at the time. And he was also taught Egyptian because Egypt was the primary empire. So a lot of trade happened with Egypt, which means if you wanted to succeed in that world, you had to know Egyptian. You had to be able to read and write it and speak it, which is one thing that Joseph could do, which is one reason why he did so well in Potiphar's house, because he was an educated slave. A slave, but an educated slave. And in that culture, in that society, once you were a slave, you didn't come out of slavery. Now, you did under special circumstances, but most times you were just a slave. And if you had children, your children were slaves, or they were the children of a slave, which means if you were the child of a slave, and let's say you got freed, or your master died, and you were released, and you could now be a normal citizen, you were no longer a slave, or you did stuff to purchase your freedom, or somebody, or your master released you, or whatever. You still come from the heritage of being a slave. So, and that was looked down on a lot in that society. And slaves had to work extra hard. Well, it really is, and it was in every society up until slavery was abolished. But yeah, that you were like lower class, and you were kept in that class. It was a caste system, like I was saying before. There's also kind of the idea of elitism, that going back to nobility, like we're the elite, we are the rulers of the this kingdom or this nation or continent or whatever, and we are superior to you because our bloodline comes from such and such and so and so. And it in a caste system, it's really hard to move between caste levels. And that's meant as a control system. It's more set up by the aristocracy and the autocracy and stuff like that to control the people underneath them. make them think that, oh yeah, well, you're a pipe fitter, you're always going to be a pipe fitter, or you're a ditch digger, you're always going to be a ditch digger. It was a means of oppression. But it's also, it also was a means of making people, really, I think it was a way to make some people who were great, it was a way to oppress those who could rise up and replace those who were higher above them. But it was also a good way to take certain people that really shouldn't have been in those upper positions, and gave them positions and authority that they really didn't deserve, really didn't earn. The thing that's interesting is the military officer corps actually comes from the aristocracy, because back in the day, officers could only come from the aristocracy. If you were not in the nobility, you were infantry, you were enlisted, you were an NCO. If you were aristocracy, you were officers. And some of that was education, some of that was just kind of that caste system, that trying to think of the word, but basically that system of control that they had. Because one thing about the aristocracy is they did not like it when the peasants rose up. They did not like it when certain people in the peasantry rose up, because that threatened their power, and especially if it displaced any one of them. They did not like that. Now, that's not to say that the aristocracy and the nobles weren't better trained. They just didn't want the average person to be equally trained, because that then threatened their position of leadership and power. And there's a whole other side of that. That one I'm not going to touch in this video. I'm just putting that in there as that was one of the driving forces in that particular in like antiquity. It's good in you're going to see it a lot in fantasy novels. You might see it a bit in sci-fi, because in sci-fi you do have the aristocracy in some of them. I've worked with the aristocracy and the common, the quote unquote peasantry, if you will, the common people, and I've worked with those in my novels. And one of the things I've found is genealogy, like I say, it does play a large role, and it does drive a lot of things, but it can also be bypassed. And you can build, you don't have to have it where you have the nobility and the peasantry. You could have a merit-based system. I've seen actual situations where there was an aristocracy, but it was an aristocracy and a nobility of merit. You were king, you were queen, you were a noble, but you earned that position. So it wasn't, in that case, it wasn't your heritage or your genealogy. That's a big one on how heritage and genealogy affects your place in society and in life and stuff like that. One other thing that heritage and genealogy affects is the list of talents you have. Your talents, your physical features, your appearance. Like, are you a really good runner? Are you good with math? Are you good with woodcraft and stuff like that? Some of that is your skills that you're born with. Some of that is your God-given gifts. Some of that is where you come from, because your family also affects the kind of person you are. Your genealogy and your heritage. If you're in a family that's full of drunkards, you're likely to be a drunkard, and that's just familial exposure. And if you have traditions in your family, you celebrate Kwanzaa, you celebrate Christmas, you celebrate Hanukkah. Your family is going to dictate, what they're going to do a lot to dictate your beliefs, your traditions, your habits, your likes, your dislikes. either through genealogy or through family tradition or habits or personalities. Your family has a big influence on everything that you are and have become and that you do and so forth. And a lot of people don't realize that, because they've had people, and this is a great example of this. They've had people where the family. Trying to think of how best to say this. Try to simplify this as much as possible. Basically, the family was big in one particular tradition. I don't remember the exact tradition, but they had this one tradition and these habits and these traits and everything that, like, I think a lot of them were musicians, for good or for bad. And this one child in the family got adopted out. Something happened to the family couldn't take care of the kid got adopted. They went over to this other family at a very young age. The other family had no musical ability at all, but they were really good at woodworking. Well, this kid became an exceptional woodworker, but he comes from a family of musicians. So upbringing and heritage has a big part in that, which, going back to your characters, that's going to be a major thing that you're going to have to look at. I mean, even look at Joseph. If Joseph hadn't been given the training that he was by his dad, when his brothers sold him down the line, Joseph would have stayed a bottom-level slave his entire life. I mean, he might have exemplified himself, but he would have struggled so much in Egypt, because he wouldn't have known how to speak the language, he wouldn't have known how to read the language, he wouldn't have known anything about Egyptian culture, how to interact with them or anything. So he would have been heavily disadvantaged going in there. And it was the fact that his father taught him all these things that put him in a position of advantage when he got there. And that also includes his work ethic, his morality, his faith in God, all that stuff. That all came from his family. I mean, you look at, in the Christian world, you look at it in the Muslim world, you look at it in the Jewish world, going back to the three major religions, or even in the Orient, Buddhism and Shintoism and stuff like that. Religion is going to be a big heritage thing. If you grew up in a Christian home, you're very likely to be Christian. If you grew up in a Muslim home, you're very likely to be Muslim. That doesn't mean you can't drift back and forth. You can't be an atheist. You can't, you grew up Christian, but you became a Buddhist or something like that. It doesn't mean you can't drift around, but it's that what you grew up with, what your family followed, is what you're most likely to do. Well, there's, for example, if you look even in early America, there's a lot of people that came over from Europe, and they brought with them a lot of the trades and the skills that they had for my ancestors. On my dad's side, he comes from, it's funny, one side of my family comes from Germany. My dad, his last name is Lake, but he's related to the Lantos, and then they're related to the Dirks, York, I think is how it's pronounced in German, who come out of Germany. And the hilarious part about them is the Dirks come from a family of nobles, low-level nobles, kind of like knight or baronet or something like that. But they come from a family of nobility who lost their noble status. I don't know the whole story behind why that is, but they eventually lost their status of nobility and became chicken farmers. No kidding. I kid you not. They became chicken farmers. Then three of the brothers from that family, because our rest of our family's still over in Germany, as far as that part of it goes, but those three brothers came over to America. And when they came to America, they were chicken farmers. They just took their trade from from Europe and from Germany, and came over here and brought it to America and just kept doing it. And for a long time, our family on the Dirk side from the Dirks, was related to chicken farming. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't diverge from there. My dad was a farmer. His dad was a farmer. My his grandpa, my dad's grandpa, my great grandpa, he was a farmer. They weren't chicken farmers. They were just farmers. So there was diversification. They weren't doing just one thing. They diversified out into field farming, but they had chickens, they had cattle. But the fact that they were farmers continued on. And that is, like your dad was a farmer, so you're a farmer. It's not necessarily always the case. In the After Offworld series, I have in Homecoming, you find out that Simon's family is interesting because Simon grew up in a farm family, and most of his relatives on his dad's side are farmers. He was going to be a farmer, but found out that he was actually better suited for technology, so he became a programmer. But he's still a farmer at heart, which part of his upbringing. One of his brothers so hated farming he became a lawyer. And I'm not gonna make a pun on that one, but his brother so hated farming he became a lawyer to get away from the farming. But then there's other ones like his sister. I don't remember what occupation she went into, but she went into a different occupation. And then, and again, that also doesn't mean that life experiences won't affect where you're going to go. Like in the case of Susan from Offworld Chronicles, which you would originally know of her as the Baroness. Her time working in Hollow Manor actually influenced her in such a way that when she comes back to Earth, she comes back and starts a maid service. Because she was a maid for a while, and she knew how to run a house, so she would have been in high demand by the modern day nobility, aka the rich elites and stuff. She would have, that would have been somebody who knew the system, knew how it worked, even though it was not in the same environment. She learned those things, and she then applied it when she came back. Because she, like I say, she knew management because she knew how to run the house. She knew how to be a maid because she was a maid. She knew all of those details, and she was able to translate that into a business when she got back. So, environment will still affect you, and and that might say, that's still going to affect heritage, but it may not affect heritage as far as your ancestors are concerned. It may affect it as far as your posterity, your children, your grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Say, like, for example, even me. I mean, I'm kind of a little version of Simon, because you got to consider my mom's family. They were farmers. Out of all of them, I think out of the 7 children, only 3 were farmers. The other 4 went off into other occupations. Mom went off into factory work. One of my uncles went off into postmaster. He became, he went off into the postal service. Eventually became postmaster before retiring. One of my uncles went into what was it? It was a government agency. I don't know if it was the FBI or Secret Service or who it was. It was a government agency. He went there. One of my aunts went into culinary and became a manager. Like I said, the other 3 were all farmers. So not everybody stayed in the original occupation, but 3 out of the 7 did. Like I say, my dad, he grew up. He was from a farm family. Grew up. We had a farm initially when I was growing up until I was like 8, I think, and then we had to shut it down because it was costing more than we were making off of it. So then Dad went to college and became an accountant. So different situation that dictated like a changing course. But if you look at him even now, despite his age, he loves to garden. So that farmer hasn't completely come out of him yet, which is actually a good thing because he grows some pretty awesome vegetables. Then you've got like my sister. She started out in factory work, which kind of mirrored what my mom did, but then she ended up going into other things and eventually becoming an accountant. So she kind of mirrored my dad. Me, I started out in culinary, kind of mirroring my aunt, and eventually realized culinary wasn't the thing for me and went into technology and information systems and have continued on from there. So, you know, there's some things that are environmental that will impact the direction you go. And there's things that will impact you based on your family, your traditions, your experiences with them. And, you know, you might do the same thing that your dad, your granddad, your great-granddad did, because that's what they did back in antiquity. The fathers taught the sons their trade. And if they didn't directly teach them the trade, they got somebody who could teach them the trade. Although there are exceptions. Going back to the Bible, you had Paul, who was originally known as Saul. His dad, he was a Pharisee. His dad was a Pharisee, if I'm remembering correctly. And I think his dad, I'm trying to remember what the backup job was, because that in the Jewish society back in those days, you had your primary job and then you had your secondary occupation. And his primary job was as a Pharisee. I think his dad, I'm trying to remember what his dad, I'm trying to remember if it was even mentioned, but his dad would have had a secondary occupation. Paul's secondary occupation was as a tent maker. He was sent to apprentice with somebody as a tent maker. And there were times he went out on some of his missionary trips that he hired in as a tent maker to fund his time in the location he was at, because, it wasn't like a completely funded ministry situation like like what we think of today, where missionary goes out to the field and everybody back home makes sure he's totally funded, he doesn't have to do a job. There's a good example of that where you'll see how this all ties in, that's, even though I'm going down this little rabbit hole, but there's this Wycliffe, that's what it is. I got a friend of mine who works for Wycliffe Translators. He's an electronic specialist in aviation, so he works with all the radios and the electronics and stuff in the aircraft, or the aircraft that's used. Now, one of the things about that isn't so much what he does, it's the fact that his particular I can't say branch or pocket or anything like that. It's his particular location, and I think maybe just everybody on the island. He's over in Papua New Guinea. And one of the things that they do over there to help make up the shortfall for what's not coming from the United States or from the people giving to to help out the different missionaries, one of the things that they do is they will use their planes when they're not being used for missionary stuff to move around cargo. So they kind of have a little side job that they do, shipping cargo for remote locations. Because these planes, they've got the Kodiaks. They had Cessnas, but the Kodiaks just walk circles around Cessnas. I mean, these things can go places the Cessnas couldn't go. Amazing aircraft. But anyways, they'll fly out. They'll pick people up. They'll fly them back as like an air service. Paid air service. They get paid for that. They will fly cargo, like if they're growing coffee, they'll go out and they'll pick that up. They'll go out to the village where it's at. Like they might be, for example, they might be flying a missionary out to the village, and hey, you got some cargo to come back. No problem. We'll just bring the cargo in, or we'll pick up the cargo, and maybe somebody has to come back with us. We'll fly you back so you can sell your stuff and bring the money back. They are periodically hired by Papua New Guinea themselves as like emergency services. Like you need to, these guys, because you got to remember, these brush pilots that fly for Wycliffe, these people know the terrain. So they're the perfect people to hire in emergency situations, to fly in food, fly in water, fly people in and out for medical care, things like that. So it's a diversion from the primary mission, which is Bible translation. Bible translation and ministry. They also do this other stuff to earn extra money, which plays back to the heritage thing. You know, like I say, I was going to segue back into that. Where, you know, you might have something that, you know, came along, like you're a farmer, and you raise a certain number of crops, but your crops aren't enough to fund you completely. It's like with my dad when he was farming initially. When he first moved into the homestead, the old house where I grew up at, you know, he was farming, and that farm was kind of break even, so he wanted to keep it going. Hopefully, you know, hoping to eventually make it where he could expand out and make the farm profitable, which it never was, unfortunately. But yeah, one of the things he did to pay the bills was he went and worked at Eaton's. And he kept doing the farm, and he kept working at Eaton's, and he kept, like I say, kept doing the farming stuff until it got to a point where it was so expensive, and he was losing so much money that it wasn't worth keeping anymore, so he shut that down. Sold off all the equipment, and we went to just getting our income from him working at Eaton's, and then eventually he moved on, became an accountant, and then that was where we were getting our money from there. So that, you know, like I say, that's where, you know, like I say, the things diverge from heritage, but also were maintained for a period of time and stuff like that. And I just realized I'm at almost 32 minutes, so I think I've got my point across. I know I rambled and went off on a bunch of rabbit trails and stuff, but at the same time, I hope you kind of got what I was getting at with this, with heritage and genealogy and things like that. You know, affecting your characters, affecting your story, and, you know, just people, their occupations, their skills, their talents, and other stuff like that. And as always, if you guys have any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, please feel free to let me know. Thanks.